Good morning, Monty. I know that today we're going to talk about your wartime experience, and also if you can start by just telling me a little bit about your background and your early childhood up to that period where the war started and you became involved in it.
Fine. Well, I lived over my dad's tailor shop until I entered the RAF. We didn't have much money, but I lived a protected life, so I didn't know a great deal of the world. I didn't want to go into the army when I was getting near to call-up age, so I thought I'd volunteered for the RAF. I had a job with a firm of accountants, and there was a chap there, a Jewish fellow, who was already imagining himself to be a fighter pilot. He went to Bush House to have a preliminary interview, and they turned him down. So he then said to me, why don't you go, which I did, and much to my surprise they accepted me. But I wasn't worried because I knew I'd have to have a very stringent medical, and I thought there's no way I can pass that medical, but I did. And I still wasn't worried because I thought as soon as I get near an aeroplane, they will think, well, I'm not suitable material for flying. But again, I did get near an aeroplane and I progressed. I didn't have any idea of being a pilot because I couldn't drive a car, or I had never had anything better than a bicycle, which made me volunteer to be a navigator because I was good at maths at school and I thought that might be of assistance, which in the event it wasn't.
It's interesting we're talking about this now because, of course, this is 2022 and it's many, many years ago that the war took place. And at the time that you went into the Air Force, you were 19.
Yes.
Did it take some time before when you enlisted, did it take time before they actually took you in, or was that a short process?
Quite a short process, but when I found that I was accepted, the majority of young chaps were sent for training either to Canada or to Southern Rhodesia. I wasn't sent there. Why, I really don't know. But they sent me to Northern Ireland, an airfield near a little village called Bishop's Court, which meant that eventually I completed my training much quicker than the chaps who'd gone abroad. And therefore I got on to a bomber squadron station, whereas others hardly had returned to the UK. I did a course in Northern Ireland. We flew twin-engine Anson aeroplanes, which were a bit old in the tooth, but were very reliable. The first time I took off, I was sick, and eventually we did the course. I finished the course and I was classified as an well above average navigator, which I suspect, in retrospect, many of the others may also have been well above average navigators. But be that as it may, I then travelled to Scotland where we flew in training, where we flew in Whitley aircraft, which were old. They were known as the Flying Coffin because they were shaped that way. When I'd finished the course in Scotland, I came down to the York area and we converted into 4-engine Halifax aircraft. The original ones were these.
Can you pick it up and show us which one it is?
Were these, which were, no, I beg your pardon, they weren't these, they were these inline engines. And we started training, but when we got further ahead, we then converted into these, which were the Halifax aircraft with radial engines. And these were the ones that were involved in operations.
So you flew in those throughout all your
Throughout
missions?
my tour of ops in that.
That painting there, can you say something about that painting?
Yes, this painting was made by a very good friend of ours, Italiaander. We met Mick and Doris when my former wife was having our second son, and Doris was in the nursing home or hospital or maternity hospital at exactly the same time as Joan, my late wife, so that Doris gave birth to her daughter Bernice, and I think 2 or 3 days later my late wife gave birth to my son Nick, and we remained good friends, really good friends, from that date until, unfortunately, Doris and Mick both died.
From the time that you actually went into the Air Force to the time that you flew your first mission, what sort of period was that?
About a year, I should think.
So in that first year there was a lot of training going on?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the initial training was in Torquay, where there was no aeroplane, but we learned the principles of navigation, and they were designed to make us really fit. And the result was we went on runs, and when we finished the run we all ended up in the sea, and we were put through it physically, and that took 2 or 3 months. And we learned the principles of navigation, like sitting in a classroom with a pen and pencil.
And when you were actually on the plane as a navigator, did you have any window to see out of?
Well, that's a very good question. The navigator was in the nose. I'll show you. The navigator sat there. That's where the bomb aimer was.
Right.
That's where the navigator was. Now, there was a little window, but so that light didn't show, because the navigator had to have an angle-poised lamp so he could see these maps.
Yes.
So that the light didn't show through that window, there was a curtain. I can tell you, as my greatest act of bravery, that I never ever once drew that curtain to look out. Never.
So you never actually saw what
I
was
never
happening?
saw the bombs going down. I never saw the conflagrations and fires and everything else on the ground. All I knew and all I wanted to know was to do my work, to get us there, and even more important, to get us back.
Yeah. And you flew on how many missions?
32.
And in general, I understand that very few missions, most people only would fly in possibly a few missions.
Well, that is true. I mean, I think there were 100,000 chaps who flew in Bomber Command, and I think ultimately about 40-odd thousand survived. And I was extremely lucky because I never got so much as a scratch.
Wow. Amazing.
Now, do you want to know anything about the crew?
Yes. Yeah.
The normal procedure was that when you got together before you started operations, the navigators always only knew navigators, the same with the rest. But we were then all herded together for the first time with pilots and bomb aiders and wireless operators in order to crew up. In other words, I would go to a pilot who I thought looked pretty capable, who hadn't done any ops before, same as me, and I would say, would you like a navigator? And he'd say, yes, and you'd made a crew that way. That didn't happen to me. I sorted a pilot, and I was then called from the top brass and said, you are flying in this crew.
Right.
And it was a special crew. My pilot I was 19, my pilot was 33, which was old,
Yeah.
but he had a great deal of experience, and he was an instructor. My mid-upper gunner and my wireless op were both just starting their second tours. My bomb aimer was from abroad and had experience. My rear gunner trained in Canada, and he was top man in his course, and he remained my particular friend until he died 5 or so years ago. In fact, when he remarried at age, I think, 89, I was his best man at age 88.
That's amazing.
Yes, it was a special crew.
And did the crew stay together as a team for most of the missions you did?
Well, that again is an interesting question. My pilot, after we'd done a few ops, had throat trouble. As a result of that, we were often not able to take part in a particular op because he wasn't well. It got to the stage when when the crew list went up and other crews would say about our crew, oh, they're not on tonight, it must be an easy target. But of course he was ill. So unlike most crews, we were on the squadron base for months and months, and eventually we did 21 ops, but over a long period. I then went on leave and I met another bloke on the train on the way back who said, we're crewing up together. I said, fine, when we get back to base, we'll get an aircraft and have a little bit of experience together to see how we work. We got back to base. We were on ops that night. We then did, I think it was 11 ops in about 22 days.
Wow.
And then finished.
So what was the period from this first operational flight you did to the last one? What sort of period would that have covered?
I should think roughly 6 or 7 months.
So it was a lot in a fairly short space of time.
Yes, yes. Funny thing is, with my first pilot, we were very matey because, you know, we lived together and we had a relationship. With my second pilot, who was completely different, my first pilot was inclined sometimes to steer a little bit off course, and I had to correct him. The second pilot, I think he would have flown upside down if I'd told him. I didn't ever get to know his Christian name. It was a very strange thing, whereas with my first pilot, who was George, and all of our first crew were on first name terms.
And so that period when you flew, that 6 or 7 months, how old were you at that time?
Probably about 20, getting on for 21.
And at that age, finding yourself in a war and finding yourself in this situation of going off on these bombing raids, how did you feel about it in terms of fear?
Well, that's again an interesting question which I can answer truthfully. About 15 years ago, one of my grandchildren asked if I would go and have a little talk to their class. Their class, it was a Jewish school, and all the boys and girls were about 7 and 8 year old. And funnily enough, I took this photograph to show them the sort of aeroplane. I only was required to speak for 10, 15 minutes. When I'd done the initial presentation, one of the little girls, I asked if there were any questions. One of the little girls said to me, were you frightened on your first operation? And I remember clearly saying, and what I said was absolutely true, no, I wasn't frightened on my first operation. I was frightened on every operation. And that's true. And I imagine most bomber crew, pilots, navigators, all of them were also frightened.
And when you flew on these raids, did you have air support? Did you have other planes flying with you?
No. Unlike the American Air Force, they flew in a box, and they had a lot more members per aeroplane. We had 7, they had probably about 12, and they bristled with guns. But they didn't have what you're referring to, fighter cover, and nor did we. But we flew as individual aeroplanes. In other words, there was no contact with any other aeroplane. In fact, you could do a whole operation and never see another aeroplane.
So if you went out on a mission, would there be other aeroplanes that were going to the same mission but not that you wouldn't see, or you were just doing it as a lone plane?
No, never as a lone. On the contrary, one trip we did, I think there were 1,000 bombers.
Wow.
But normally, on a normal operation, there could be any number from 50 to 500. The only time we were alone was we did 2 trips mine laying.
Right.
and that was colloquially called gardening.
Right.
You laid mines, and in fact the very last trip we did was gardening. We flew to the east of Copenhagen and laid mines there. And mine laying was not something you fancied, because either you were on your own, perhaps there were half a dozen aircraft on the trip, you were on your own, and it could be quiet and you never see anything or ever have any trouble. But if there were German night fighters around, you could have one each or two each.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very enjoyable.
And if you were laying mines, did you have to fly lower because of that?
No, you didn't.
You were still at the same
I think you still flew at height. Normally, on a bombing trip, you would fly at anything between 19 and 22,000 feet.
Right. I remember reading in something that you wrote that on one occasion, I think I'm correct in saying that one of your planes coming back into land was attacked by a German fighter.
Yes, I wasn't flying that night, and I was in bed asleep, and I heard the rat-tat-tat-tat-tat of machine gun, and what happened was that German fighters or light bombers, whatever, followed our stream back home, and when our aircraft were getting ready to land and everybody was relaxed and probably nobody looking out, the fighters attacked and shot several down.
You mentioned that in some of these raids there would be as many as 500 or even 1,000 bombers. Were they all British planes that were flying together?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm intrigued that we had that many. And when you were flying, what sort of places were you actually flying to? Were you bombing?
Well, a variety of places. Now, one German area that we flew to quite a few times was the Ruhr. So we had raids on Duisburg and Dusseldorf and Dortmund and Essen, all in the Ruhr, which was the German very heavy industrial area. It was known, the Ruhr was known in the RAF as Happy Valley. And as a complete aside, my son Joe, who was a very keen Tottenham Hotspur supporter, went to Dortmund several months ago to see a football match. And I told him that I'd been to Dortmund, and I said, when you're there, don't mention that your dad had been there.
Very sensible.
Yeah.
And in the raids that you did you ever do any raids where there was a combination of British and American bombers?
No, never.
Never. Okay.
Most of the RAF raids were mostly 19 out of 20 were at night. The American Air Force raids were always, I think, almost entirely daylight.
Right, okay. And when you did your last raid, did you stop at that point because the need to do the bombing had come to an end, or was it just that you completed?
No, it was I had completed my tour, and if you like, I can talk about what happened once I had completed my tour.
Yes.
Once you completed your tour, the RAF really didn't know what to do with you. They had to give you at least 6 months off, but you were still a member of the RAF, ex-air crew, so they sent you to different places really to play out the time. Now I was sent first of all to Hereford.
And what sort of what date would that be roughly?
That would have been early 1945 or late 44.
So what stage was the war at that point?
Well, the war was still going strong, if I can use such an expression.
Right.
The British Army invaded France together with the Americans, and of course the war against Germany didn't end until, I think middle of 45.
Yes.
I was sent to Hereford in order, of all things, to train as an RAF accountant. That was a bit of a fiasco because a new intake of RAF officers who were never intended to fly arrived at Hereford to train as accounting officers.
Right.
We arrived and there was perhaps 20 ex-bomber people, and they then thought that we would do what the others were doing, fall into a squad, quick march, all of that stuff. We didn't do any of that. So the first morning we all turned up. I mean, some of us had caps on, some didn't, most of us were smoking. I smoked in those days, but we had to come to terms, and the result was that every member of ex-bomber crew who did the course failed, everyone.
Right.
And funnily enough, I failed, but only just, despite myself. And I was offered to do another 3 weeks, which I declined.
Right.
So they then sent me off to another airfield, I think to Doncaster. No, that's wrong. They sent me to an airfield in near Wolverhampton, Halfpenny Green. And I spent time there, and then I went to Doncaster, and Doncaster, they had pilots coming back from abroad.
Right.
Who had an acclimatisation course, and I appointed myself the navigator. But unfortunately, after a while, they told me I'd got to fly with them as well,
Yeah.
which I did now and again.
Yeah. And for all your hard work, you were given an award.
Given
An award.
Yes,
What did you actually get?
Distinguished Flying Cross.
Right. And I don't think many people got that, did they?
No.
And I know that you also got a letter from the King.
I got a letter from the King, yes. I could show it to you if you like.
I will. Yes, actually, if you.
It's not a letter, it's a card.
Right. Yes, I'd be interested to see that.
Well, I'll have to find it, but it won't take me long, because I've got a lot of photographs here.
Do you want to just turn it round so that I can,
Yes.
I can see it there? Let me just zoom in on that.
There may be other photographs here as well. For example, that was my pilot.
Right. And that's of course you with your medals
Yeah,
on parade many years later.
many years.
And the top one on the right is you as well, isn't it?
That's me.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember saying, I think at the some years ago, when I'd written a letter or written a little article, that I said that when I joined the Air Force, I joined as a boy, and when I finished, I came out as a man.
So actually, how many years were you in the Air Force?
About about just over 4 years.
And then once you left the Air Force, you then started work.
Yes, yes. Before I entered the Air Force, I was articled to a firm of chartered accountants, and my articles expired while I was in the Air Force.
Right.
And I then got a job with a firm of chartered accountants, Levy, Hyams and Co., a good Scottish firm. And they had offices in Oxford Street, and I joined them, and eventually I qualified as a chartered accountant and set up on my own.
So what year were you demobbed?
I was demobbed in December 1946.
And where were you at that point?
Well, it's amusing. First of all, when I left one of the previous airfields, I was sent on indefinite leave. Then I was posted to Uxbridge to deal with a desk job, repatriation of overseas flyers. I was at Uxbridge for, I think, 5 or 6 months, and then when I came to be demobbed, they sent me up to, I think it was a place near Blackpool, and I was demobbed, as I said, in December 46, and I got a job. I was demobbed in December, and I started work at the beginning of January 47.
And you mentioned something about, was it Nettishall?
Yes.
So maybe you could just say something about
Yes,
that.
I can. One of our raids was a daylight raid, and I think it was in the afternoon or late afternoon, but we took off, completed the mission. As we turned to come back to home, we were advised that our airfield at Melbourne, our bomber station was at Melbourne, which was a village about 8 or 10 miles from York. Our airfield was fog-bound, so we were diverted to an American bomber base in a place called Nettishall, which was in Suffolk. And we were there for about 3 days because when we were ready to come home, they found there was something wrong with one of the engines on our aircraft. So they had to get engineers from Bristol because our engines were Bristol Hercules engines.
Right.
And we had a very jolly time because they'd never had a RAF crew there before. They made a big fuss of us. They had their PX stores, which was their equivalent of the NAFI. I smoked in those days. We never took cigarettes with us when we were on a raid. An American navigator attached himself to me, took me to the PX, said, "Do you need some cigarettes?" I said, "Yes." Gave me a pack of 200. 20 wasn't good enough. And we had quite a good time. The food we had was unrecognisable compared with the food in the RAF stations. You know, you'd get up in the morning, you'd have scrambled egg made with fresh egg, not the powdered stuff. Yeah. Scrambled egg with maple syrup, and we did all right.
So when you look back, you're now how old?
98 and a half.
And so it's a long time since you were 20, 21, 22
yes.
in that situation. When
yes.
you look back at what happened in your life then, what are your thoughts about all of that?
Well, I can't believe, when I look back, that I was involved in RAF Bomber Command. It doesn't seem possible. Tragically, I suppose, even now, I never had a moment's sympathy for the people who were on the receiving end of the bombs we dropped. Never.
Yeah.
And I suppose it could be classified as very callous. But all I ever wanted to do, as I said to you earlier on, is to do my job, to get my crew to the target and get them home. I never concerned myself with what was happening on the ground.
Yeah, and I suppose there has to be an element that it wasn't as if we wanted a war and we started
Absolutely,
something. We
yes.
were forced into having to do something.
Yes, and I was conscious of the suffering that people endured in the UK from German bombing raids.
Yes, understandably. And of course you were able to maintain some contact with some of the people that, as you mentioned, even after the war for many, many years.
Yes, well, I maintained a friendship with our rear gunner. We were close, and we used to, with our respective wives, we used to meet up for lunch every 2 or 3 months. One of our crew was from New Zealand, and he obviously went home. One of the crew was from, I think, Switzerland. He went home. One of our pilot apparently got a job in commercial flying in Canada. So you lose track. We met up with the bomb aimer after many, many years. We found him, but he didn't really want to know.
Yeah.
He wanted to leave it all behind him.
And I suppose that's understandable as well.
Yes, I suppose so. Strangely enough, he was, I think, Czech, and he spoke the most beautiful English, most eloquent English. I don't know where he'd been educated, but he was much classier than the rest of us.
And when you met, of course, Mick Italiaander, who you mentioned, the painting, was my dad, and when you mentioned meeting my parents, and particularly meeting my dad, in terms of you met probably soon after, I mean, how long after you were demobbed, after the war?
Well, I was demobbed at the end of 46.
So it was about 5 years.
That's right, we met your late parents, must have been in 51.
And did you ever talk about your experiences you'd had during the war, or not really?
Not really, no. Neither did your dad.
Yeah. Okay. Monty, thank you very much. It's been really interesting to hear about all the things you did.
We're done.
We're done.
Marvellous.